mentioned to you previously, this is a kind of a seminar called Friday Talks, where we basically have the opportunity to invite speakers where they present broadly their research agenda. You will have 1 hour to present your research agenda, your perspectives, and then we will have 1 hour for Q&A. So thank you so much again, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Christian. Yeah, thank you. I think I'll stand here just because I need to. Are you sure? Okay, cool. I can go ahead then. Yeah, thanks. It's also a huge pleasure to be here, to teach the mini course, and to come here today to talk about my research. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I'm gonna basically present my research agenda via 3 kind of papers that I've published or that I've been working on. The first part of the lecture will be maybe quite technical, because it's quite a technical paper, and then the second part of the lecture will be more about policies, so maybe more accessible. But if you have any, I know we'll have questions at the end, but if you have any questions for clarification, then please put up your hand and let me know if you get lost, because the first part is maybe quite technical. Okay, but the title is Finding Fortunes, Measuring the Super Rich and Policies for Redistribution. So just to start with, I don't know how many of you have seen this graph before, but why do I focus on wealth and wealth inequality? What you see in this graph is this is from the World Inequality Database. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, you have wealth as a share of income for the private wealth and public wealth. And what you can see is that basically over the last 40 years, private wealth as a proportion of income has been increasing quite dramatically across most countries in the world. This is just a selection of some of the countries that they presented. And we've also seen a decline in public wealth to the point that now public wealth, and public wealth what we mean is governmental wealth, right? The wealth that's owned by the government. And what you've seen is basically wealth relative to income has become much more important. But the government has effectively, in most countries now, gone into negative public wealth, right? And why does that matter? Well, I think this is something we feel every day, right? We feel it in terms of the prices of housing being too high, or the rents that we have to pay being too high relative to our income, or the fact that it feels like today, particularly for younger people, if you don't have inheritance or help from your parents, it's much harder to make your own way in the world. And that's because wealth has this historic aspect to it, right? Wealth is something that kind of is passed on through generations. It kind of means that the past and the inequalities of the past shape the future. And as we see wealth increasing relative to incomes, this is only going to determine more and more of our life opportunities, right? So I think this story of the government is effectively bankrupt, wealth is becoming more important, is I think one of the biggest transformations of our economies that we've seen over the last 30 years. However, when we look at the super rich, or the very top, the data issues become much more problematic. So this is the top 1% of the UK wealth share for 3 data sources. This source here, this is the survey data, right? So this is just what the government, they went out and they tried to measure the rich using survey data. And what can we see? We can see that on the one hand, it's much lower than the other data sources. So this data source here is the World Inequality Database from Thomas Piketty. And this is the survey data with data from journalists from rich lists. And what basically you see is that the survey data really underestimates the degree of wealth inequality. And it also, you know, we have very different stories here, right? When you have the rich list data, you have an increase in inequality. When you have the survey data on its own, you're seeing a decline in wealth inequality. And so this raises the question of, okay, which of these is true, right? How do we deal with these issues? In the first kind of 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about a method or a new method I'm trying to create to tackle this problem of the super rich not being in the surveys. So there's kind of two questions of the talk. The first is, how much do the wealthiest really own? And the second is, what policies can we use to redistribute wealth? And the policies I'm going to look at are wealth taxation and also looking at workers' bargaining power. And I'll show you some empirical work that I've done on both of those things. Now, my work mainly focuses on the UK, but many of these methods are applicable to other countries. So this kind of simple question, how much do the wealthiest really own? As I say, is the problem is what's called differential unit response bias. In other words, your probability of responding to the survey declines as you get richer. And this is a particular problem in the very, very tail of the distribution. In other words, within the super rich, because basically there's evidence from Kinnickle and Bova from the US and from Spain, which show that the super rich, you know, the billionaires, are much less likely to respond to the survey than just the rich, the millionaires. And that makes sense, right? The super rich, they're not going to want to tell the government how much money they have. They're very hard to access. They might have more time constraints. So they're just much less likely to respond than the mere rich. And what this means is that, as I've shown you, the top 1% in the survey data tends to really underestimate the degree of wealth inequality. Do you want to? So I think one question that applies across many countries of the world is, okay, we have this survey data. What can be done to tackle this differential unit response bias ex post? In other words, after the survey data has been collected, because we want to make, we want to use the data that's already been collected. Now, if we knew the non-response process, in other words, if we knew exactly how the probability of responding changes with wealth or income, then it's very simple to just tackle the problem. What you do, and this is what some statistical agencies do, they just re-weight people. In other words, maybe you have a billionaire or a multimillionaire in your survey. What you do is you give them a much bigger weight in the sample, and that can sometimes correct for the bias. But in practice, this non-response process is not really known. Now, there's many other methods on how to tackle this problem. So Coronek, what they do is they look at different geographical variations to try and come up with an estimation of how probability responds across different geographical regions, and then basically say different regions have different levels of income, and then we can kind of try and reconstruct this response process. There's a paper by Blanchet where they use tax data to basically look at how response changes for rich people versus just the super rich. There's a set of literature looking at Pareto distributions, and this is probably the closest to what I'm going to present today. A Pareto distribution is a particular type of distribution where we have effectively some very, very rich people in the distribution. And these things show up a lot in wealth inequality. But the methods that do this just on their own, they tend to underestimate the degree of wealth inequality. The fourth approach is to add rich list data. And the second part of the lecture today, I'll show you what happens when we do that. And I think this is generally quite a good approach. But the problem is many countries don't have rich list data. So I think Colombia doesn't have a rich list, for example. And by rich list, what I mean is journalists going out and collecting data on the super wealthy. So I think there's a gap for a method that estimates the non-response process in the tail without having to rely on external sources of data. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. We call this method differential response maximum likelihood. basically it estimates the non-response process in the tail, and it doesn't require any external information. So you could apply it to many different countries across the world. I'm going to do what's called a Monte Carlo simulation. Basically what that is it's like a simulation on the computer where you effectively test to see if your method's working. And I show that when we do that simulation, the method does quite a decent job of estimating the actual degree of wealth inequality. And then I'm going to apply this to the UK, to the UK's ONS Wealth and Asset Survey, which is our version of your wealth survey. And I show that when we do that, the method actually does kind of come up with comparable estimates. Yeah. Maybe we can skip this and actually skip the next one. Yeah, and skip this as well. Okay, so now I'm going to present some maths. All right, but let's, yeah, like ask a question if you get lost. It's actually not that complicated. We can think of any distribution of wealth, right? Let's say we're talking about Colombia, and we're talking about wealth inequality within the top 1%, right? So what we're looking at here is wealth inequality within the top 1% in Colombia. Now, for any survey, right, let's say you go out and you survey that population of the top 1%, you're going to have some people that respond, and that responding wealth vector we call Y1. You're going to have some people that don't respond, and we can call that wealth vector Y0. And you have some response indicator 1, which is basically 1 if they respond and 0 if they don't. Differential response bias is very simply your probability of responding depends on your wealth level. Right? Now, the problem is we only ever see the wealth of the people that respond, and we only see whether or not you respond. Right? We don't see the wealth of those that don't respond. So the question is, given that we don't see that, is there any way to derive a likelihood function to estimate the unbiased parameters of the complete distribution? Now, a likelihood function is basically, I don't know if you've studied this before, but it's kind of like where you have a functional form for what you think the distribution looks like, and then you estimate parameters based on the data, depending on what the kind of most likely parameters are. Now, we have here our function. It's got 3 variables, the 3 variables I just discussed, and then we have the parameters that determine basically the different random variables. Now, Little and Rubin, they say that we can factorize this into basically 2 things. The complete data PDF. This I'm going to show you, we can assume, based on our understanding of wealth in other countries, that this follows something like a Pareto distribution, which has a particular functional form. The response probability, this is just the probability of how, as you increase wealth or income, how much does your probability of responding to the survey change, right? So we basically, this is just a simple selection factorization. Okay, now, the way it works is the following, right? For the households that respond to the survey, their contribution to the likelihood is basically given by this. You have some observation of some wealth level, and then you have your complete wealth distribution. And you have some observation of your wealth level, and you have your response probability. And that you can just look at for all of your different, you have your functional forms, you can plug that into your data for each of the people that you observe, and you can try and estimate some parameters. It's this one here that's a bit more confusing, which is this is the likelihood of responding to the survey for the households that don't actually respond. And it's this thing that enables us to kind of, I don't know, do the magic trick of, okay, we don't know what the wealth of those people are, but what we can do is we can say, we don't know what their wealth level is. So what we can say is, rather than it taking a particular level of wealth, you take an integral of that. And an integral is effectively just saying it could take any value within that integration, right? So if you remember back to your calculus, an integration is just a kind of area under the curve, and basically that's what this is saying. So we're just saying the integral takes into account the fact that for a given sample of observed values, we have some kind of unknown range of unobserved values. But differently, there are many possible permutations of what that wealth level could be, which lead to a sample with a certain vector of observed households. So the integral sums over all possible permutations. This is referred to integrating out y0. So basically, the total response function is you add those things together. This isn't so important. We can probably move on. And then this is what we then provide effectively functional forms for the complete distribution and the probability, the response probability. Now, what is a functional form? A functional form is just like a mathematical function which we kind of impose. And this is also a huge assumption that we're going to make, right? So I think the first assumption is that the complete distribution of wealth in the tail for, let's say, Colombia, follows kind of a Pareto type 1 distribution. In a Pareto type 1 distribution, the actual just equation of it looks like this. We have to make an assumption like that, because if we don't make an assumption like that, we can't say anything about the missing data. Now, there are evidence from other countries where we have a better description of the top 1%, which says that these Pareto type 1 assumptions are fairly reasonable assumptions to make, but we have to kind of do something. The second one is basically just a logistic function. In fact, it probably is easier to see on the next slide. Yes, okay, so the alpha, I can describe the parameters actually. So y min, this is the level, it's called the Pareto threshold. In other words, it's the point at which the Pareto distribution starts. And what I'm going to say is that this is just the level of wealth to be in the top 1% of the population. So I think in Colombia, I can't remember, that's like 2 billion pesos or something. I think 2 billion pesos to be in the top 1%. In the UK, it's like $4 million. So if you have basically $4 million in the UK, then you're in the top 1%, and we're going to count you as being part of this Pareto distribution. The alpha measures the degree of inequality. It's called the Pareto shape parameter. The alpha is generally between about 1 and 2.5. If the alpha is lower, so if the alpha is about like 1.1, 1.2, then you have a lot of inequality. If the alpha is higher, like 2.5, the inequality is less. So it's kind of like the lower the level of the alpha, the more inequality you have, okay? And as you're going to see, this alpha is super important. It's this alpha that we're going to try and estimate, right? We don't know alpha. Alpha determines the degree of inequality, and it's that thing that we're trying to estimate using this method. The second function, this guy, maybe rather than looking at the maths, if I just show you I think this makes it actually much clearer. This is what I mean by a function, right? These are the functions, but we don't know what the parameter values are. So you could have a parameter value like this. What do we have? On the vertical axis, you have the probability of responding to the sample. And on the horizontal axis, you have the amount of wealth, okay, in log scale. So in other words, as you get richer, your probability of responding declines, right? Now this function has basically 4 parameters. The first parameter is basically what is the probability of responding at the Pareto threshold, right? In other words, to be in the top 1%, to just be in the top 1%, I said it was $4 million for the UK. In this case, we could say the probability of responding is about 3.6. In this case, it's 50%. Then you have the S parameter, which basically determines the steepness of the slope. And then you have this floor, where rather than it going to 0, we want basically billionaires will still have some probability of responding to the sample. So in this case, it's kind of more like 20%. In this case, it's 10%. Okay, so that's what I mean by the response process. It's this function here that we're trying to estimate the parameters, right? We assume it follows this shape. We don't know exactly what the parameters are. So just to kind of summarize what it is that we're doing here, we have our function. We're trying to estimate the Pareto shape parameter because that's the thing that determines the degree of inequality. We will also estimate the slope, that slope, of the non-response function, and we will also estimate the minimum floor. And what we can get from the data is the Pareto threshold, right? We know that from the data. I'll show you we can find from the data the responding, the rest of the parameters that we need, which are the responding households in the tail, the number of people that were sampled in the tail, and the response probability at the Pareto threshold, right? So let's maybe just show you the Monte Carlo simulation. So are you familiar with Monte Carlo? I don't know why it is called a Monte Carlo simulation, but it's like, Monte Carlo is obviously the area where they do the car racing. Basically, it's like a simulation where you say, look, let's come up with a synthetic distribution, which follows a Pareto type 1. And that synthetic distribution has these parameters. So we say y min is at 2 million. We say the non-response function has these things. So the floor is 10%. In other words, billionaires have a 10% probability of responding. The slope parameters doesn't really have an interpretation, but it's 4 million. The probability of responding to the sample if you have a wealth of 2 million is 40%. And there's 1,000 people who are sampled. Right? And we do that for different Pareto shape parameters. So I said it kind of can go from about 1.25 up to 2. Right? And basically what I do is I do that 10,000 times. We apply our estimator to it to see, okay, does the method accurately capture the Pareto shape parameter? Okay, that's what we're trying to do. So there's like a synthetic distribution with, let's say, a Pareto shape parameter of 1.25, we apply the method to the observed data. Does it actually capture it? Okay, just for now, focus on this and this. So what we have on the horizontal axis is the Pareto alpha. So let's look at a case where the real level of inequality has a Pareto alpha of 1.25. Let's say we just look at the responding data and we just try and estimate in a naive way without doing our method what the level of inequality is just from the observed data. And what we get, what this says on the vertical axis is basically how much of a bias there is. So what we end up with is Pareto shape parameters that are about 40% higher than 1.25. So this is 40%. So in other words, we massively overestimate the Pareto alphas, which means that we underestimate the degree of inequality. But when we do it with the DRML method, what we end up with is basically unbiased estimates. Okay, so this is why the Monte Carlo is useful, because it kind of allows us within a simulation to test these things. So given that then, right, and we can show that the method kind of works, let's apply that now to the UK data. So the ONS, as I said at the beginning, so the ONS is our like statistical agency. This has not kind of fully tackled differential non-response bias within the top 1%. How much time have I got? Maybe just for the sake of time, I might quickly go over this. But basically, In fact, maybe let's go just to the results. But I basically apply this to the next one as well, Christian, if you want. So I apply this to the UK wealth and asset survey data. You know, we impose Y min at the 99th percentile. We derive the other parameters from the data, and we estimate the Pareto shape parameter. And then using that, we can kind of reconstruct the kind of true level of inequality. If you go, keep skipping. Sorry, skip. What we end up with is, remember this is the graph I showed you at the beginning with the raw survey data. We end up with an example like this. The red line is when we use this DRML adjusted. So it basically does increase the level of inequality, right? We go from, let's take 2018 to 2020. The raw data says that the top 1% own 11% of wealth. With our adjustment, it goes up to about 17%. But as you can see, there's still a huge variation, right? The rich list data says it's more like 25%. I think Colombia, the top 1% own 40% of the wealth, right? 40. So you can see that the UK wealth inequality is lower, but there's still quite a huge level of variation here in terms of the estimates. And I think to some extent this is the first conclusion. The method that we looked at, right, that's maybe we can skip to the next. Maybe skip this one. You know, these differential response problems, they exist in all surveys. They're kind of a known unknown. And I think what you end up with when you do these methods, there's many, many different versions of them, and you can end up with different results, right? And I think if I was to summarize kind of as researchers, what should we do, given the fact that there's that difference? I think personally, when it's available, we should use external data to supplement the survey data to understand the super rich. So where it's available, we should use rich list data or tax data because it adds in kind of new information. However, if that's not available, then we can use a method like the one that I just showed you to kind of estimate the missing wealth. And I think this has some benefits, right? It explicitly models the non-response process. It doesn't rely on external data, so it can be applied to a wide set of countries and a wide set of issues. And it also, I mean, that's maybe slightly less important. But I think, you know, there's some limitations which are, we're estimating quite a few parameters here, so there's some uncertainty in the estimates. And yeah, it kind of doesn't tackle small sample bias, but that's not important. So yeah, I think really in a way, we need, you know, if you can add more data in, that's probably the best example. And that's kind of what I'm going to do now. So after doing that first paper, what I thought was, okay, how then can we come up with other data sets for the super rich? Now, the Sunday Times, this is one of the most popular newspapers in the UK. And basically every year, in May of each year, by the way, we've kind of left the more complicated mathematical part now. We're going to go towards the more kind of policy discussion, right? So the Sunday Times every year in May produces a list of the richest people, right? Sometimes it's 1,000, sometimes it's 250. It's a shame actually there is not a paper that does this here. And the way that, I mean, but okay, maybe I'll ask you guys a question. Who do you think was so the Sunday Times started in 1989, okay? Who do you think the richest person in the UK was in 1989? I appreciate you probably don't know that many rich people in the UK, but maybe have a guess of who do you think the richest person could have been? What do you think? So this is like 30, nearly 40 years ago. Anyone want to take a guess? Who's probably the most famous, who was the most famous British person? The Queen, right? Yeah. So the Queen was the richest person in the 1980s. But what's interesting is that today, the King, right, who owns the same estate, is now 256th, right? In other words, in the last 37 years, there's been over 200 people in the UK who are now richer than the monarch, right, than the king. And I think that shows like the degree of inequality, right? These people are kind of coming from business, they're coming from finance, they're coming from industry. And the Sunday Times, I think, is an interesting example of this. So what I did is I went to the actual archives of the magazine and kind of used, you know, Python to extract the data and to try and link the people over time. And so what you end up with is a data set where sometimes it's 200 families, sometimes it's 500 families, sometimes it's 1,000 families, 250, 350. Now, I quite like this. This is an advert in one of the magazines. It says, if you can actually count your money, you're not really a rich man, which I think was quite a good example of the problems of trying to observe the super wealthy. But the very wealthy, the way that the journalists do it is they try and find wealth based on identifiable wealth such as land, property, your shareholdings, private companies. They also are very well connected. So what they do is they'll actually ask rich people, okay, who's rich? There's a kind of, sometimes rich people want to be on the list because it shows that you're very wealthy. Sometimes they don't. Can we get to the next one, Christian? Okay, so if you look at from the 1980s to today, using this data set, what's happened to inequality? And so this is the top 0.001% within the UK, which is about the wealthiest 350 people. And we see that it's gone, that those 350 people, right, which is not a very large amount of people, they own, in the early 1990s, they owned 2% of the wealth. Today they own over 7% of the wealth. In other words, their share of wealth has nearly tripled or over tripled. It's an extreme increase in inequality. If you go to the next one. And what's interesting is you can look at the US using Forbes data, Estados Unidos, and you see a similar increase, although actually in the UK the inequality is higher and it's increased by more. And this kind of has raised the question in the UK of, well, look, this runaway inequality is potentially a huge problem. What can we kind of do about it, right? And so this building here, this is in London. This is the Bank of England, right? This is our central bank. And some campaigners have, in this picture, they have put a projection onto the central bank that says 80% of millionaires support a 2% wealth tax over £10 million. And there's been this kind of big debate in the UK that's been growing about, should we implement a wealth tax on the super rich? So £10 million, which is what, like $15 million. What we're going to look at now is the debates on whether or not we should implement that, and also to discuss a little bit about the Colombian wealth tax, because Colombia is one of the few countries in the world that has a tax like this, and so I think there's a lot to learn about whether it's successful or not. So one question is, okay, should we implement a new wealth tax? And different theoretical perspectives, to some extent, will say different things on this. So PK, this represents post-Keynesian economics. And this says that maybe, yes, redistributing from the super rich to the rest of society, what that does is it increases overall aggregate demand, right? Because a dollar in the pockets of a billionaire versus a dollar in the pockets of someone like us we would much more likely spend that money in the real economy, while a billionaire is probably just going to keep that money hidden in some offshore tax haven. So if you redistribute money, what happens is you increase overall aggregate demand, and you can lead to higher growth, more productivity, and a more dynamic economy. So this is a paper by Özlem Onaran, which does a wealth tax model looking and showing exactly this. I think what's also interesting is if you take the most basic mainstream neoclassical model, right, microeconomic model, then what's the underlying assumption about how utility changes with income or wealth, right? The underlying assumption is that you have diminishing marginal utility, right? In other words, as you get richer, adding on another pound to your income gives you less utility. So at the social level, right, if we extrapolate from that individual to the social, from that becomes a very clear point of redistribution, right? If you take from the wealthy and give it to the poor, and you keep the level of overall GDP the same, then you have a higher level of social utility. And this point was made by Anthony Atkinson in 1970. He said that inequality is the inefficiency in the production of social utility, right? We could, with the same amount of resources, have more overall utility if we have more equal societies. So I think what's kind of interesting is you don't even need to go to any heterodox economic theories to have a clear case for redistribution. Then you have a kind of set of Marxist perspectives, which I think would maybe be a bit more critical of wealth taxes. They might say that really, so I don't know if you know the economist Yanis Varoufakis. He was a Marxist Greek finance minister. He kind of argued at the time that wealth taxes are kind of utopian because really they don't deal with the power dynamics of the government and the relationship between the government and the class interests. And really the people advocating for wealth taxes don't have a theory of the state. And so I think this is an interesting point. And then there's a kind of new series of ecological economists that are saying that wealth taxes are really necessary in order to fund the types of green transformations that we need in the economy. So we need kind of, and at the same time, Lucas Chancel from the Paris School of Economics, he's done a lot of work showing that basically the super rich have much, much higher emissions than the rest of society as well. So let's kind of now go a little bit into what do we mean by a wealth tax and what are the kind of choices and trade-offs that we have. So a wealth tax is simply a tax on the stock of wealth, where the stock of wealth is your assets minus your liabilities. So we're not talking about capital income taxes or capital gains taxes. We're talking about a tax on the stock of wealth, right? How much wealth you have. And this could be your property, your first or your second home. This could be your businesses, your pensions, your financial or your physical assets. And we tend, with wealth taxes, to want to value those assets as they would be valued if there was a market for those assets, right? That's what's called open market valuation. So how do those different types of assets change across the distribution? So here, this is for the UK, using just the raw survey data. We have the different assets for the total population. So in the UK, pensions are the biggest type of wealth. Then the housing is the biggest type, the second biggest. Financial assets, so these are like stocks and shares, and then private business assets. If we compare that to the top 0.01%, so these are people with wealth of above 10 million, we can see that for them, business and financial assets are the most important assets. Pensions become much smaller. Housing also becomes much smaller. Now, there's kind of three questions you need to answer when you're looking at trying to implement a new wealth tax. The first question is, where do you set the threshold? And what is a threshold? The threshold is very simply, where does the tax begin, right? So let's suppose the threshold is 10 million and a person has 30 million in wealth. then only 20% of their wealth would be taxed. 30 minus 10. I think actually in the Colombian case, you actually don't have it like this. I think your threshold is if you suddenly become above the threshold, all of your wealth is taxed. So it's not like a marginal tax rate, it's an average tax rate. But anyway, here's the thresholds for different countries. There's really only 4 countries in the world that have a history of permanent wealth taxes. So yeah, Colombia is one of them. And basically, you are only taxed if you have over 3.5 billion in pesos, which is around 889,000 US dollars. And I think this is, in fact, if you go to the next slide, this is basically how much wealth do you need to be in the different percentage groups in Colombia. For that, you are in basically the top 0.1 to 0.05% if you have that level of wealth in Colombia. So this is in millions of pesos. So this is 2.8 billion, 4.2 billion. So yeah, it's only a very, very small numbers of people who are actually affected by the Colombian wealth tax. If you go back to the previous slide. So yeah, actually back to the previous one. There we go. So in Norway, it's actually, I think I've done that wrong, but in Norway it's more like 200,000 US dollars. In Spain, you need kind of a wealth above 3.4 million dollars. In Switzerland, you need a wealth of lower of about $100,000. In the UK, as I said, people are pushing for a wealth tax above 10 million. So a trade-off, right, is should you have high thresholds or low thresholds? If you have high thresholds, you're only taxing the super rich, which is obviously maybe good for, if you have a low threshold, let's say you include more people in the tax, which means it could be good for revenues, but it can cause, as I'll show in a sec, like liquidity and administrative issues. Go to the next one. And then the second question is what rate, right? At what percentage are you going to tax that wealth? So the rate at which the stock of wealth is taxed is simply just the percent, right? So let's say, again, you have 30 million in wealth. The threshold is 10 million. It means 20% of the tax, 20 million is taxed. And let's say the tax rate is 2%, then you would have 20 million taxed at 2%, which is you would pay £400,000. There's different examples of different thresholds. In Colombia, it's gone from about 0 to 6%. In Norway, about 1.1. Spain, 2.5. They're arguing for a 2% wealth tax in the UK. Thomas Piketty is arguing for a 90% wealth tax above 2 billion. Yeah. So he's basically saying, if you're a billionaire, you should have all of your wealth taxed away, right? That's effectively what he's saying. Again, there's some trade-offs here, right? High rates generates more revenues, and it maybe tackles inequality, but it might also incentivize more tax evasion, right? Because if you're facing a high rate, you're more likely to want to hide your wealth abroad. The kind of third question is like, how often do you do a wealth tax? So on the one hand, you have an annual tax, which is every year you're taxed on your stock of wealth. And I think the Petro government in 2022 turned the Colombian wealth tax from a temporary wealth tax into a permanent one. Although actually, the other example is to just do a one-off tax in response to some kind of shock or crisis, right? So like COVID comes along and you say we need to raise some money, we'll just do a one-off tax. Now the trade-offs are, I think the one-off tax is often less susceptible to tax evasion, right? Because you kind of announce it as an emergency tax. Maybe you announce it without people really knowing that you're going to announce it. And so you can't kind of evade the tax in the same way. However, I mean, one-off taxes, they tend to not really impact the distribution so much. They obviously raise less money. And I think there's a credibility issue, which is, they say that they're one-off, but then they tend to actually become part of the tax system. So in the Colombian case, it's been temporary, but I think it's basically has been renewed every year since every parliamentary term since 2002 when it was initially implemented. Okay, so we're going to spend the last 15 minutes looking at some criticisms of the wealth tax and how do we respond to those criticisms. So the first one is tax avoidance and evasion, right? Won't the wealthy just simply leave? Secondly, we'll look at liquidity issues. So like, what if you have a lot of assets but you can't pay it because you don't have much cash? Thirdly, haven't most wealth taxes failed in the past? Fourthly, can we actually properly value some assets? And fifthly, these kind of come with a big costly political fight. Is it really worth it? So tax avoidance and evasion. So this is probably the number one thing if you go and talk about wealth taxes on the super rich. The question is, won't they just leave, right? They can leave the country, give up their citizenship. They can fragment their wealth, right? So they could give their wealth to their cousins and their family members and et cetera, to try and get them below the threshold. They could hide assets abroad illegally, or they could put their ownership in a trust, which means that they're no longer taxed. Different types of evasion require different solutions. So let's say you're in a country where you think the rich are going to leave. So this is what people are arguing is going to happen in the UK. You could, in theory, implement what's called an exit tax. This is what they have in the US, which is, let's say you give up your citizenship. It means that you have to pay like 40% of your assets in effectively a tax when you leave. I think if you wanted to tackle hiding assets abroad illegally, what you could do is you could invest in the tax authority's capability. So a lot of the revenues from these taxes are raised by only a very small numbers of people because of the fact that the inequality is so extreme, right? So it's only the billionaires that have most of the wealth. And so what you could really do is create a unit within your tax authorities that just really track the wealth of those super rich people and see, okay, is anything dodgy going on? And, this could be something that could be done, particularly these days because you have financial data reporting. So you have the FATCA in the US, and you also have the Common Reporting Standard. If you go to the next one. The problem is, though, so there's a literature that tries to estimate how much do the rich evade taxes when you implement a wealth tax or when you change the tax rate, okay? So you have different countries. There's a famous paper from Colombia, but you have countries in Denmark, Spain, France. And what they basically try and estimate is this thing here called the elasticity. The elasticity tells you if you increase the tax rate by 1%, how much as a percentage of their wealth do the rich hide their assets? And what do you see? You probably can't really see, but basically the estimates range very, very dramatically. So in Colombia, let's say it's 2%. In other words, in Colombia, they say if the government wants to increase the wealth tax by 1%, then the rich are going to hide 2% of their assets. However, there's a paper here from Norway where they say that it's 66%, right? In other words, if the government increases the tax rate by 1%, then effectively the wealthy hide or in some way avoid 66% of their assets. So it's really hard to tell from the empirical literature what's going to happen if, let's say, the UK implements a tax, right? Is it going to be more like Colombia? Is it going to be more like this Norwegian example? I think this one is probably a bit of an outlier. There's a more recent version. So this author here, Londoño Vélez, she's at the university. She's a Colombian academic at the University of California, but she's the kind of main person researching the Colombian wealth tax. I think her latest paper, again, she finds this 2% elasticity. If you go to the next one. This is from an article that actually Christian shared with me last week, the source was supposed to be here, but from the old the tax minister for the Petro government. Basically, what this shows is the share of people in Colombia that admitted to tax evasion. And what you can see is that the super rich, the top 0.01%, are much, much more likely to admit to tax evasion than just the rich. In other words, 40% of the super rich say that they're doing some type of tax evasion. This comes from the fact that in Colombia you have this situation where the tax authorities, they basically have these amnesties, right? So they say to rich people, look, if you tell us, you can tell us that you did a bit of tax evasion in the past, and we won't send you to prison, kind of thing, right? And you can pay a small penalty. And so kind of some rich people want to do that because they're worried about criminal prosecutions, right? So it's this kind of thing. And using that data, they show this, which I think is interesting. Okay, the second problem with the wealth tax is this problem of liquidity, right? So there's some people who have lots of assets, but not much money. So farmers, for example. Farmers tend to have a lot of land. Maybe that land is very valuable, but they don't make actually much income. Small business owners as well, or startup businesses. So let's say your problem. One way to maybe tackle this is a problem. One way to maybe tackle this is, okay, let's say you have this startup business. Maybe you can pay for that, not in terms of cash, but you can pay in shares of your business or something, right? So this is it's called payment in specie. So you don't pay in cash, but you say, look, I'll give you the equivalent in the shares of your business. This happens a bit for inheritance tax in the UK, but I think it doesn't maybe fully get around the problem. Yeah. The third issue is the number of countries with wealth taxes has been significantly declining over time. So, and if we go to the next one, the reason why is they all kind of follow quite a similar pattern, which is they often start with maybe the thresholds that are too low. And what that means is it includes things like housing, it includes things like pensions, and then or some kind of business assets. And then those assets effectively are excluded for some kind of political reason. And then what happens is the very super rich buy those assets to avoid the tax. So this is what happened in Spain. In Spain, they exempted business assets from the tax. And what happened is the super rich just basically converted all of their assets into business assets in order to evade it, right? So I think one of the kind of key lessons from this is in order to do a tax, you can't really have any exemptions. And then the second last problem is, what about valuing those private business assets? So one of the reasons why they are exempted is because it's often really hard to value a private business. How do you do it, right? It's not like there's a stock market for it, or it's not like there's a housing market for it, right? How do you actually really put a value on what a private business actually is worth? Maybe you can take some measure of income or profit, and you can say, okay, it's a multiple of this, but as soon as you do that, people try and game the system. Maybe one solution for this is, again, rather than paying in cash, the business could pay in shares. So the government would come along and say, look, we think your share price is worth this amount. If you think it's wrong, then just give us the equivalent in shares. So you're kind of trying to create a bit of a market for it. And then the last one is the kind of problem of the politics of it, right? I mean, wealth taxes, they hit the most powerful people in the country. And the most powerful people in the country have a lot of resources to resist against that. So in the UK at the moment, what we're seeing is there's been a lot of pressure on the government to implement a tax, but the super rich every day in the newspapers are saying, if you do this, we will leave. If you do this, we will effectively leave. So this kind of UK exodus of millionaires, for example, there's been last year there was 10,000 articles in the British press, which is the equivalent of 30 articles a day. And this was all based on one report, which basically said that, people have left the country because they're worried about a wealth tax. But actually, when you dig down into the report, about 9,000 millionaires left the UK last year, which is only about 0.31%. It's a tiny, tiny fraction. So there's this kind of like hysteria that's created, and I think this is partly to do with the lobbying power of the super rich. The Colombian example is also really interesting. So there's this paper which looks at why the wealth tax was implemented in 2002, which I can't remember the president, who's from the right? So like, it was the right-wing government that actually implemented the wealth tax in Colombia. And the reason why the paper argues is basically the super rich. There were kind of three reasons why the super rich protested, but they kind of accepted it. The first one is because there was a massive security crisis within the country, right? So, and the security crisis was also affecting the business community. So in the paper they say there were about 2,500 kidnappings per year. 15% of them were targeted towards the business community, right? So not the majority, but clearly was having an impact. And so the super rich, they basically realized, okay, there needs to be some kind of increase in the security state. The second is there was a cohesion amongst business and governmental elites, right? So it was like, okay, we're going to implement this tax. We're going to use the money to spend on beefing up the security, but we'll do it in a way that doesn't fully redistribute all your wealth, right? So there was this kind of cohesion. And then lastly, there were improved perceptions amongst that community about the tax revenues were actually being used to kind of make the super rich lives safer in Colombia. So for example, the tax when it was initially implemented, it was quite a significant amount. It represented 20% of the defense and security budget. And it increased the personnel in the army by 100,000 people in the first term, right? So the implementation of the wealth tax in Colombia was very much kind of this consensus between the business community and the super rich to build up a security state. And I think that shows you, I think it's an important lesson because a lot of the people arguing for wealth taxes, like Thomas Piketty, I guess some of us in the UK, right? The politics actually of these things are incredibly important about why the tax is able to exist, right? In the UK at the moment, the super wealthy are really fighting against it, and there's probably not this argument that there's enough of a crisis that's affecting them for them to accept it, which is a very different situation to Colombia today. Colombia in when it was implemented in 2002. How much time have I got? Oh, I should probably finish really. Yeah, 5 minutes. So, using the Sunday Times Rich List, I did like a simulation of how much money would a 2% wealth tax above 10 million raise, and also what the impact of that would be on inequality in the country. So I assume that this tax was implemented annually, every year, starting in 1994 and finishing in 2025. Now, because I'm using rich list data, this is only the top 230 people, right? It's not everybody with wealth above 10 million. I think the poorest person on the rich list has like 350 million. I also assume that 20% of the families, they leave the UK when the tax is implemented in order to try and estimate some of the evasion responses. And I only look at tax residents, which is about 287 people. And that simulate. Oh no, we can go to the. Oh yeah, so that's if we did that basically just from that top 230 people, we would have raised about £5 billion per year, which isn't a huge amount of money. If we look at everyone above 10 million, it would be about 24 billion, which is about 1% of GDP. This figure comes from a slightly different paper, but basically that's using one. Remember I talked about the elasticity of evasion, right? And I said in the Colombian case, they estimate the elasticity of evasion to be 2%. This figure has an elasticity of evasion of 17%. So quite a significant amount more, because we want to kind of effectively be conservative on how much we think it would raise. And yet, even with such a high evasion rate, we get about 1% of GDP, which is about the same as Switzerland. The Colombian wealth tax currently raises about 0.27% of GDP, right? Which is not very much money, right? And that's because of the huge evasion response in Colombia, right? So like a lot of people are hiding their assets. If we look at just some of the wealthiest people, so this is the wealthiest family in the UK. They're called the Hinduja family. The red line is after the tax. The black line is before the tax. We can see that a 2% wealth tax each year would have kind of considerably reduced their wealth. And then I'll just show you some other families. The Duke of Westminster is another one of the richest families. Again, like, their wealth would have still increased over time, but it would have been kind of slightly dramatically reduced. Yeah, okay. And that's another one. Yeah, we can keep going. Okay, the last point I want to make is this, which is connected a bit to what we were discussing in the classes, which is okay, taxing then, it has some issues connected to it. So the last paper that I did was looking at, okay, if taxes aren't that effective, what other policies do we have? And what we have here on the left is the top 1% wealth share for the UK, the USA, and France. What we have on the right is the trade union density rate. If we go to the next slide. And I think there's many reasons why trade unions will have an impact on the wealth share, the top wealth share. So on the one hand, let's say you have an increase in trade unions and workers become stronger. What that does is it can lead to changes in the labor income distribution. It can lead to changes in different prices of different assets. It can lead to differences in saving rates, and it can impact inheritance flows, which all can have like different impacts on the wealth distribution. And what I did is this thing called a structural vector autoregression. It's a type of like macroeconometrics where you basically have to make an assumption, which is called a contemporaneous exogeneity assumption, which is that in a way union density impacts wealth inequality within the year, but wealth inequality doesn't impact union density. In other words, union density in some sense is contemporaneously exogenous, which I think is not an unreasonable thing to assume because it's like an institutional variable. It's quite slow changing over time. And what you then look at is you control for other factors that might impact inequality, like technology, globalization, taxation. And then you run these things on the right, which are called impulse response functions. An impulse response function is simply, if I increase union density by 1%, what would its impact be over like 10 years on the top 1% wealth share? And you have the UK, the USA, and France. We have our confidence bands, which are 95% confidence intervals. And as you can see, an increase in union density leads to a decline in top 1% wealth shares that is significant in all three countries. If you go to the next slide, which you could also represent it like this, which is maybe more interpretable, which is called a vector forecast error vector variance decomposition. Basically, I show that over a 10-year period, the changes in union density explain around a third of the changes in wealth inequality in the UK and France, and about 8% of the wealth inequality in the US. So I think union density is a very important variable for changing inequality at the top. Yeah. So to summarize, right? I appreciate that's a lot of information. So when we're measuring the super rich, I think we should always look for external sources of data, right? Can you find tax data? Can you construct rich list data? How do we bring in new data sets? If we can't do that, then we have to rely on the survey data and the methods that I presented to correct that data. And then in terms of how do we redistribute, the debate around wealth tax I think is important because taxation is a clear policy that could redistribute, but it's plagued with the problems that I talked about, right? Which is there's issues of the political fight, the political economy, there's issues of tax evasion. These can to some extent be tackled, but really we shouldn't be utopian about what the impact is going to be. And then lastly, then what other policies do we have? Well, I think we should start moving towards trying to think about how do we build back the power of workers within trade union density and within workers' bargaining power, because this is shown very clearly to have a significant impact on inequality. Anyway, thank you very much. And yeah, I look forward to hearing what questions you have about any of the things I've discussed today or related topics to do with inequality. Thank you.
Gracias. El profesor tiene un trabajo con Greenpeace calculando un impuesto renovable nacional para el Reino Unido. Y aunque la tasa propuesta me parece modesta, es 2.5 a los superricos, dice que con eso se puede financiar mucho de la política ambiental del Reino Unido. Trabajos limpios, menos emisiones, hogares cálidos, etcétera. Mi pregunta es, me pareció insuficiente el análisis como ecológico, es decir, dice que los agricultores podrían devolver el 30% de la tierra cultivable para la naturaleza, pero me parece que esta economía, como las otras, cuando intentan recuperar la naturaleza es mucho lo que hay que invertir, mucho el cuidado de las especies perdidas, de los suelos a recuperar. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿eso no le parece insuficiente el tratamiento sobre los aspectos ecológicos a recuperar?
So he's talking about previous work you have with Greenpeace about tax on the wealthiest in order to fund green policies and transition, and specifically like you apparently estimate a tax rate of 2.5, something like that, and to get a specific amount of money. And with that amount of money, you imagine that you can fund a specific policy for the agricultural sector, and you kind of claim that you can return, farmers can return like a 30% of the land or something like that. But he thinks like probably you are being too optimistic or too positive about the ability to return this property of land in the agricultural sector, because probably the ecological process of rebuilding or recovering the land, it's more complicated than you might imagine. So his question is like, what about if you have thought more carefully what actually implies the recovery of the land, is the land and the nature in the agricultural sector, that probably is more difficult or more costly than you imagine. Algo como eso.
Thank you. Yeah, Yeah, thanks. And thanks for reading the Greenpeace report. So that particular statistic of rewilding was taken from another piece of research that Greenpeace had done, which was not done by myself, right? So I was focusing more on the tax side, like the revenue generation, and then there were other kind of co-authors who were focusing on the rewilding. So in terms of specifically answering your question on whether or not the numbers involved for that project are over-optimistic, I'm not sure if I can give you a decent answer now, but I will have a look, and I can write to you. I think though, maybe just to talk about the tax part. So in that report, you know, I think something this isn't really answering your question, but it kind of talks about, I guess, the optimism of a tax, right? Like, can we actually raise the revenues that, for example, I was saying in that report, which were about 25 billion pounds per year, right? So about 30 billion US dollars per year, which is about 1% of UK GDP. And a lot of people say, look, you can't do that, because look at what happens with wealth taxes in the rest of the world, right? Look at Colombia, look at Spain, look at Norway. These taxes are not raising even 1% of GDP, right? In Colombia, it's what, 0.2%. I think that's it's an interesting criticism, because in order to get those numbers, you know, I take basically the survey data, I add the rich list data, I provide a tax simulation model, and I assume that there's an elasticity of evasion of about 17%. So much, much higher than the estimates that they're making in the Colombian example. But yet, we still get quite high results, and it's in a way, I don't know, it's an interesting conundrum, right? Because we're getting kind of high levels of potential revenues, and yet other countries of real existing wealth taxes aren't showing that. And I think partly it's maybe to do with this issue of exemptions, right? In many countries, you have exemptions for some assets, due to some kind of political reason, and the wealthy then put their assets into those, their wealth into those exempt assets, and it undermines the revenues of the tax. So yeah, I appreciate that doesn't kind of answer your question, but I guess in terms of the optimism of some of the numbers in the report, I think the kind of conclusion of the lesson is, if we were to do a tax in the UK, we couldn't have any exempt assets. I think that's a really important lesson that we'd have to learn from the other examples. But I'll have a look at the rewilding statistic and let you know. Thanks.
¿Se escucha? Okay, I'm going to try talk about in English. Okay, you say about the redistribution wealth, but this is the old people say. But what is the methodology how to implement this solution? Because, for example, in the case of Colombia, the tax is the IVA is a tax about
VAT, yeah.
About the consume in Colombia, but is regressive, and the problem is the objective of the tax is, for my point of view, is mistake,
Mm-hmm.
because all the people say effective distribution, but how? And you say, for example, fight with politicals, but what politicals?
Mm.
And for example, this is for me, you can improve the with this part.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's a great question. It's a good question. In Colombia and in many countries in the world today, the effective tax rate, right, is regressive. So what is, maybe let me just explain, what is the effective tax rate? The effective tax rate is how much tax do you pay in pesos divided by your income, right? So it's a percentage. So for us, I don't know, maybe it's like we pay, I mean, in the UK, I probably pay an effective tax rate of around 40% when I add up my income tax, my VAT, etc., as a percentage of my income. The effective tax rate for normal working class people is much higher than the effective tax rate for billionaires, right? And it's exactly to do with what you're saying. It's because over the last 40 years, we've seen a transformation of taxing, which is, you know, before we used to have taxes more on things like wealth, on top incomes. We now have much more of our taxes coming from things like VAT, consumption taxes, or labor income taxes. And that means, so do you know I think the third richest person in the world at the time, Warren Buffett, do you know him? He's like a US financier. He had this quote where he said, look, I pay a lower effective tax rate than my secretary. So it's partly to do with this fact that VAT and et cetera has become more important. The other thing is because Warren Buffett, he made most of his income basically through what's called unearned capital gains, right? So he had this company called Berkshire Hathaway that made really, really high returns each year. It's one of the most successful financial companies in America. But he never took any income from that, right? He never really took a dividend. He actually lived in the same house he lived in the 1950s. But his wealth was increasing so much. And because it's effectively unearned capital gains, right? He never sold any of his assets. He never took any dividend. It means that that increase in wealth is never taxed, right? And I think this is why a wealth tax at the top is kind of necessary, because it kind of tackles that failure within our tax system to deal with these kind of very high increases of returns at the top, but there's no way to actually tax that. So I think there's kind of two things going on. One is to do with the increase in consumption taxes, and the other is to do with this unearned capital income tax. So in Colombia, you see exactly the same thing. There's a regressive, the effective tax rate for poorer people is much higher than the effective tax rate for the rich. It might also in Colombia being driven by tax evasion as well, right? So the super rich can evade the tax. So they effectively pay much lower rates. There was a report by Oxfam, which was in the article. I'll put this on our shared class list as well, where they show the effective tax rates across the distribution, and it goes down in Colombia. So this is just, this is obviously, I think, unfair. It's obviously, we think we have a progressive tax system, but we actually have a regressive tax system. And this is why I think we need these, we need to reform the system. Now, maybe just to say one other thing, what I discussed today is the idea of a unilateral wealth tax, right? So one country, like the UK or Colombia, implementing a wealth tax. There's also been a lot of movements to see, can we implement a global tax on billionaires via the UN and via the G20? This is being spearheaded by President Lula from Brazil. Have you guys seen much about this? It's very interesting. The politics of it are, again, probably aren't really gonna, I wonder what's gonna happen with Trump being the president. Probably he's not gonna push for this, right? But there's certainly an increasing consensus of some countries that say, what we should do is have a global tax on billionaire wealth, and that would effectively deal with so many of the problems that I outlined, right? Okay, you'd still have a political fight, but you wouldn't really be able to have the problem of evasion, because every country in the world would be included. And there are some precedents for this. We had in the OECD a global minimum corporate tax rate through the Pillar 1, Pillar 2 system, which was implemented in 2021. It has since been under threat because Donald Trump wants to pull the US out of that, or maybe has pulled the US out. But there have been examples of these types of coordinated global tax systems. So I think this is an interesting area to look.
Okay. Hello. Hi. My question is, which is the impact, real impact of inequality in economic growth? I want to know that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Macro, as understanding causality at the macro level is very hard, right? Because everything is affecting everything. It's partly why when we do these macroeconometric exercises, like the structural vector autoregression, that's a way to try and tackle these. But when it comes to inequality and growth, everything is so endogenous that it becomes really hard to entangle the causal effects. That said, there's a big literature looking at the relationship, just the cross-sectional relationship. So if we look at like countries over time, the UK, the US, etc., the highest, we grew the most in the 1940s to the 1980s. And this is the period where inequality was lowest. And since then, growth has been declining and inequality has been increasing. This, again, is not causal evidence, but I think it shows that there's a potential negative relationship between growth and inequality. Theoretically, I think there's many reasons to believe why inequality would lead to a decline in economic growth, right? On the one hand, you have the aggregate demand issue that I discussed. If so much more of the resources and wealth are in this, in these assets at the top, it's gonna mean less money effectively being used for consumption, driving growth in the economy. Then the other thing you see is a lot of the resources are then going to kind of unproductive assets. So in the UK, for example, we've seen a huge increase in house prices, and the financial system now really relies on effectively extracting money from the housing mortgage market. And a lot of that is just completely unproductive, right? Like, if a house price is increased by so much, you might have a wealth effect. It might mean that people spend more in the economy because they feel like they're richer, but you're not improving or increasing the productive capacity of the economy. Also, an increase in these kind of land or house prices can mean that it's harder to set up businesses, it's harder to have like so much dynamism in the economy. Young people have to pay so much of their income to rents that accumulates in the bank accounts of older people, etc., etc. You can see why this would have a significant dampening impact on growth. So for me, I think, it's theoretically and looking at the broad-based empirical evidence, there's a clear negative relationship. But there's arguments the other way, right? So people would say you need inequality to incentivize entrepreneurship, right? So if you have high taxes on the wealthy, people aren't going to want to set up a business, right? And therefore you can stifle innovation this way. I don't know. when you actually talk to entrepreneurs and business people, whether or not there's a 2% wealth tax is probably not going to be the thing that determines whether or not you set up a business, right? Because you're probably thinking, okay, is my business going to be profitable is the first thing. So actually, wealth taxes relative to, let's say, corporate taxes, wealth taxes tend to be less dampening on the productivity of businesses than, let's say, corporate taxes, right? Because corporate taxes, they tax a percentage of your profits, right, each year, which to some extent might have a dampening impact on reinvestment and productivity. In a way, the wealth taxes, there's a paper by the IMF that makes this argument that I can share. Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to say something. The first is a comment about the wealth tax here in Colombia. I think that the description made by the article is fair. But also I think the agreement the President Uribe achieved with the super rich was also, let's say, favored by other areas of the economic policy where his economic agenda actually favored the economic accumulation of the super rich. So, for example, he cut down many labor rights for workers.
Yeah.
So, you know, severance payment, all this kind of stuff basically disappear under his governance. So labor costs went down and it improved the ability of economic accumulation for the richest. So it was also kind of like, okay, you have to pay now this, but at the same time I'm creating conditions for economic accumulation that are favorable for you. And in other areas also there were reductions of what they call like zonas francas. It's particular spots where if you put a company there, you pay less taxes and this kind of stuff. So at the end, the effective tax rate probably, you know, the balance at the end probably is not that bad.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is the politics there involved it's more complicated than just a pure sacrifice from the super rich. So just to give you what I think is a more nuanced perspective of what was the politics behind or the politics driving this decision. On the other hand, given that we are on an academic scenario and we can kind of say radical things, I think like a little bit this conversation about tax, wealth tax is a little bit misguided in the sense that, in my view, the core of the conversation should be if in a capitalist society should be allowed to have inheritance. And I think that a liberal society, a democratic society, shouldn't allow to have big inheritance. Of course, the small inheritance like here in Cali, I'm not saying that you cannot get this small house from your dad. Okay, take it easy, guys. But when you're talking about Paris Hilton, you know, this person has contributed nothing to GDP, and you get all this amount of wealth, and for what? So when you think about paying 90% tax on wealth, when you know go after a certain amount of threshold, you are basically saying we don't want inheritance. And because if you reproduce inheritance at this level of wealth, what you are creating is an elite. And the elites are also disruptive for democracy because they are the lobbyists, they are the ones that are shaping democracy, and they are shaping the laws, and they are shaping the laws in their favor, etc. So they are corrupting democracy. Democracy is not anymore for the people, it's just for them. So at some point we should get transparency in the conversation and say, we love perfect competition. And perfect competition, the assumption is an infinitude of small producers. So if we're going to be serious with what we teach, with what we actually believe in, is why we have to big corporations, large corporations. You know, it's fine. You know, Steve Jobs, he gets what he gets. At the end, we reset the game and we start again. And so I think this framework is probably the Varoufakis idea that, you know, you had actually to create a theory of the state and and bring to the table and the conversation what is exactly the kind of capitalism we want. I'm not saying that we shouldn't eliminate private property. It's just at some point, for the working of capitalism itself and for the working of democracy itself, big inheritance is becoming actually self-defeating. And when I think in terms of if we should have big inheritance or not, that framework provides kind of a theoretical, again, framework where the conversation about if the wealth tax makes sense or not. I think I know it's more controversial, but if we are here to change the world, probably we start asking the right questions first. And why, I mean, just the existence of the loyalty in the UK, and it's kind of stupid and crazy, sorry. But I mean, I was educated in France, so, you know, we do other things with kings, but, you know, again, I think it's this kind of questions, like why a person that has no merit, just the only merit is to be the son of a guy, is entitled to get an inheritance of billions and billions and billions. For me, it doesn't make any sense.
Maybe just quickly to respond, yeah, I mean, the first thing is inheritance taxes are such a funny thing, right? Because I think a lot of people would agree with what you're saying, and yet they're the most unpopular tax, right? When you survey people about like which is the tax that you dislike the most, inheritance taxes are like so unpopular. So if you try and increase inheritance taxes, you try and implement inheritance taxes, the public absolutely hate them, which is kind of bizarre, right? Because it's like this concept that why should you inherit a fortune, particularly a billionaire fortune, is just to seem obviously unfair and obviously goes against every basic tenet of justice that you can have. I think part of the reason why people don't like them is because it's something that you have to pay when like a loved one has died. So there's a kind of issue here. So maybe a way, yeah, I mean, and maybe the broader question, right, I think is, so the Piketty idea of, okay, should we have like, almost like a limit on wealth? And there's actually a really nice book by a Swedish philosopher called Limitarianism. No, what was her name? I'll find the book and I'll find the author name. But the book's called Limitarianism. She basically went around the world and said and asked people a question. I can ask this to you, which is, what's the level of wealth above which, if you made any more, it just wouldn't make you any happier? Right. So like, what's the kind of like? It's not like what do you want in life, but like what's the maximum that like if you made any more, you just wouldn't make it wouldn't make you any happier. I don't know. Does anyone want to shout out a number of what kind of that level of wealth might be? And then I can tell you what she found in most countries in I think the global north. Do you understand the question, or do you want me to tell you what she found? Oh yeah, go. No, yeah, you go. So like a nice house. I think this is kind of what most people think, right? And actually, if you speak to rich people, they say, look, actually, it is kind of ridiculous. Like, I've satisfied all my basic needs. I have, like, a really nice house in the city. I have a really nice house in the countryside. I have all my nice cars. I have all my nice clothes. And yet the money just keeps pouring in, and I'm like, I don't really know what to do with it, right? And it's ridiculous. Okay, and then you get to the super rich who then use their money for political influence and stuff, right? But I think basically what she found was she said most people say around, in, let's say, Europe, they would say about $10 million, right? $10 million. Because that kind of would give you like a decent house, you know, and enough money to make some income so that maybe you never had to work again in your life. No, but, you know, the people that we're looking at here, 10 million is just so much less than the billionaires, right? And so I think in response to your point, it's like, okay, it's about inheritance, but also this extreme wealth is just clearly an unproductive use of resources. And so I have a lot of sympathy with the Piketty, let's create a limit. Maybe it could be, maybe it could be 50 million, right? Above 50 million, all of your wealth is taxed away, or 1 billion. I think the reason why at the, let's say, the G20 UN tax debates, they're going for 2% rather than 90% is because of politics, right? Basically, they say what we need to do, and you can talk to them. Like, so it's Gabriel Zuckman is the person who's pushing this. And what he'll say is, look, we need to start with 2%, get the tax over the line, and then we can increase the rates, right? Then it can go to 10%, then it can go to 20%. So it's a kind of, it's a political thing, because if you go in too high, then it's going to be completely fought against. Yeah.
Anybody else? She's asking about in your data set of the riches that you got from the, what is the name of this magazine? Sunday Time. You know, the amount of the riches is shrinking over time.
Oh, yeah.
If it is something related with the wealth tax, that because there is an exodus of the super rich, so it's something related to that.
No. That's a good, that's a good question, but no. It's just the journalists. Sometimes they have like money to look at it for the top 1,000. Sometimes they just look at the top 250. So it's more a decision by the magazine on who they include. It's not to do with the changes in the actual inequality. Yeah, it's a kind of, I guess it's the Sunday Times is making less money. So they say you can only do the top 250. Yeah, but good question.